Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have an excellent show this evening. I am so thrilled to have the three gentlemen that we have on, starting out with Barry Greenwood, a longtime researcher, started all the way back in 1964, Jan Aldrich not far behind him, and Dave Marler, all at Dave Marler's place. I was supposed to be there, unfortunately. That was the International UFO Congress went virtual, so that kind of made my plans change for that one. But I was thrilled when David said that we could still do the show the old-fashioned way, the way I usually do anyway. So they're joining us through the online studio and coming right up, and we're going to be talking all about that. I do want to thank everyone that does help out with the show behind the scenes. Everyone does a wonderful job. I'm blessed with that. And also, I want to thank those people that help out with the show and the supporters of this show. Anyone can do that over at Patreon, and our Patreon is right on our website. The link's right there. This week, by the way, this is a Monday night show, and I do thank all these people that I see that are already joining in. I had to do it on today because tomorrow was not going to work out for the gentlemen that we have. So the blog this week is by Charles Lear, as always, Airplane Passenger UFO Sightings. It's a really good one. You want to check that out over at podcastufo.com. That's enough for me, and I'm going to bring in my guests right now, all three of them. Welcome to the show, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Here we go.
Here we go.
And yes, so glad to have you. And, Dave Marler, I'm going to put you on the spot right now because you probably forgot that I knew that it's your birthday.
I was hoping you would have forgot.
Happy birthday, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thanks for spending your special day with a bunch of old codgers and myself. No, I mean, including myself.
I couldn't ask for a better birthday gift. Two of my mentors in the field, as well as a friend and colleague, yourself. So this is wonderful.
The only thing is they replace codgers with hunks. That sounds better.
Okay.
Yeah. All
right. That sounds good. All right, you hunks. So why are you all gathered? Why are you all gathered together? Well, first of all, I really think, as I say every week, and the longtime listener probably gets tired of hearing me say it, but we have new listeners to the show constantly and I know that because I'm getting emails almost every week from someone new. Mm-hmm. So let's do a round table as far as introducing ourselves. We'll start with you, Jan, since you're closest to the camera.
Okay. I have a history degree from the University of Maryland. I spent 50 years stealing from the government, 25 years in the Army, and 25 years from the post office. I've been interested in UFOs since junior high, so that's back in the late 50s. Basically what I've been doing for 50 years is collecting material. And now it's time to put it all together and get it filed and get it scanned.
And that's kind of what you're doing. That's part of what you're doing there, correct?
Yeah, that's what we're doing here, besides making fools of ourselves.
All right, Dave, it's your turn.
Yeah, David Marler, independent UFO researcher, historian, really following in the footsteps of these two gentlemen who really paved the way, along with many other great, credible UFO researchers and historians. I got involved in 1990 in the subject actively, had been interested since I was a young kid, but not really till 1990 did I get involved. And really touching on what we're doing right now, Martin, when I first got involved in UFOs, I rather naively thought I could go to the local libraries and look at books on UFOs. And much to my disappointment, there were few, if any, UFO books at the local libraries. And rather naively, the thought crossed my mind, well, I'll have to just create my own library. little did I realize 31 years later, it would get to this point. And we're in the process of still collecting new material, new information. But to Jan's point, we're here really trying to organize the material, scan it. It's nice to have a physical archive, wherever that may be. But realistically, we want to make sure this information is readily available to the worldwide UFO community. And the ultimate goal is not just to amass the physical materials, but to Jan's point, get to the point where we're now digitizing it and eventually making it free and available to the worldwide UFO community. Because with all due respect to my colleagues here at the table, as well as myself, there's a lot smarter people than us that might be able to piece together these disparate elements regarding the UFO history and the UFO subject, and maybe begin to come closer to gleaning answers to what this phenomenon is all about.
Excellent. All right, you're up, Barry.
Yeah, well, I've been investigating and researching UFOs since 1964. I had a long-term interest in the history of the subject. I could divide what I've done in it into two parts. The first part might be considered government historical, where in the late 70s I began to use the Freedom of Information Act with a few other researchers to release government papers on UFOs. Project Blue Book had closed in 1969, but it was clear evidence that the government was still doing work on the subject, so we used the FOIA to gain access to at least a dozen different agencies' records on the subject, and it was quite amazing what was coming out. Each release led to more releases because of the information contained in the earlier information. So we amassed somewhere around 4,000 pages up to 1984, and at that point we decided to do a book explaining what was coming out, and I wrote it with Larry Fawcett. It's called Clear Intent, later called the UFO Cover-Up. And then the FOIA became more and more difficult to use with succeeding administrations, and I decided to shift over into UFO history, and from that, archiving, to attempt to preserve the historical record on the subject, which was in great danger of disappearing due to neglect, people passing on, not leaving their records to others to take care of, and we needed not only archiving, but we needed a network to make sure that information circulated freely. I call this new project preservation and dissemination. We need to scan and preserve the records first, and then once that's done, to disseminate to interested parties so that they can see what the history of the subject was all about.
Right, and I don't know who wants to handle this part of it, but how do you feel that the digitizing of this is going to perhaps draw the younger enthusiast as interest because it's digital? Or Dave, let me ask you this: do you have any young people? Has there been any young researchers interested enough to actually make a trip there?
A few, definitely a few, but to your point, Martin, we're concerned about the future of ufology in the sense that, and I really would take this statement and extrapolate it with history in general. Most people aren't interested in history, whether it's UFO history, World War II history. There are those historians, those enthusiasts, but admittedly, quite often I get asked at conferences, what's the latest, greatest in UFO research? And I don't care what's new, I care what's credible. And to be quite honest, some of the most credible cases are 30, 40, 50 years old in the government's own files and in the historic Dr. J. Allen Hynek CUFOS files here that we have. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to really sift through all of this decades worth of material and really distill it down to what are the most credible cases. Admittedly, and we always say this, but I think we always have to say this, the vast majority of UFO sightings can be easily dismissed as meteors and satellites and atmospheric conditions that yield unusual visual imagery or optics or airplanes seen at a distance. But there is that small subset that definitely deserves to be investigated. And I would say that since the Pentagon report this year, that we are starting to see mainstream scientists and scientific organizations take an interest. Dr. Avi Loeb of Harvard, as well as NASA, has even started looking into the subject. So we're seeing a sea change within the phenomenon.
So could I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Go right ahead.
Our focus is history. That's not the only one, but that's the main one. We're interested in hunting for aliens or speculating on what's going on. You can't really study UFOs. You can study UFO reports, but the United States Air Force and Project Blue Book were real things that emanated information, records, and interviews that you can study. And of course, the UFO witnesses and other organizations that were interested in, official organizations in a lot of cases, that were interested in the subject. So that's what we're trying to do, have a reservoir of UFO cases that hopefully somebody in the future, and hopefully somebody with a lot of scientific power, somebody that is far more competent than we are in pacing things together, they will have a record that they can call on.
Right, right. I'm going to throw this out to you just because it's a little frustrating, and I don't know who would like to handle this, but one of the things in the report, I believe I did read through it. It was when it first came out, but it seemed like they were not going to investigate earlier cases because they say they didn't have the equipment and technology to really gain good data from that. And my argument with that whole thing is, one, David, you mentioned that there are some amazing cases that are 30 and 40 years old. And two, they often say, well, these things that the pilots are seeing could be Russian, they could be Chinese, and they throw out all the old cases where things were doing 25,000 miles an hour and stopping on a dime. So I don't know if anyone wants to just kind of elaborate on what's frustrating to me anyway.
Mark, I would just add to that that I've always stated in my lectures, do not look at one UFO case in a vacuum. We have decades worth of worldwide reports, and I believe one of the strongest, most compelling things we can do in absence of having hard physical evidence is looking for patterns in the data. I believe patterns in the data are suggestive of a real phenomenon, whatever that is. It's still the elusive question, what are we dealing with? But to your point, there's what's in the Pentagon report and what's not. What's not in the report is any modicum of history. If you were to read that report and you never heard of UFOs before, you would think that this phenomenon began in 2004, based on the time frame of cases, military cases that they were looking at. And of course, your audience know that's not the case. There is a wealth of information, as Barry has shown with his research, looking at the government's own records. You don't have to look at tabloids. You don't have to trust UFO investigators. Look at the declassified documents that exist through Barry Greenwood's efforts and later John Greenwald's efforts in getting these documents released and made available to the general public. They're highly compelling cases in these matters. And then when we start collecting this data, you do start to correlate, I think, as Jan alluded to, newspaper accounts with civilian UFO investigations with government documents. And what I'm working on currently are vintage archival interview recordings with UFO witnesses. When you synthesize all these disparate elements, it helps paint a picture. It adds color, it adds depth to this phenomenon that we're looking at. And I think it's somewhat ludicrous that they arbitrarily want to discount all this information prior to 2004 when they themselves have never even looked to see what data we're sitting on. And so I find it, a rather arbitrary way of approaching the subject. I certainly encourage anyone to come into the field, especially if they have that scientific acumen to bring to the table to look at this phenomenon. But I think they're doing themselves a disservice, at the very beginning by just arbitrarily ignoring the decades worth of information that we have.
Yeah. Anyone else want to?
Okay, here is a report from the Korean War in 31 May 1952. They brought over the highest tech aircraft they could from the United States. And they didn't want the Chinese or North Koreans to get it, so it was behind the lines. So aerial objects that penetrated the lines were, these guys took care of it. They had at the time, it was the highest tech that existed, F-94 aircraft. It could go faster than others, and it had the afterburners, so it could supply more speed. It had radar, and these were the best trained people they sent over with it. One night, one of the F-94s kind of saw a light, and they went to investigate. And this will sound familiar if you've listened to the case with Flavor and his companions from the F-18s. They started descending towards the light, and the light mirrored their image. In other words, coming up as they're going down, and it was a close approach case. It came head on at them several times, within 50 to 100 feet. The colonel that was the radar guy, he said after that encounter, as fast as they were going and as scared as they were, he was sweating. He was sweating. They investigated. They sent over investigators from Japan who were intelligence people, and the colonel asked him. He says, "Do you get many of these?" And he says, "Yes, we get a lot." But yours is the best aircraft case at night because you got the closest to these UFOs. Now, we don't have the high tech that we have in 2004, but this case is similar, and it was with the highest tech they had in 1952. That, to me, you put the two together and you say, yeah, our technology has evolved, but these UFOs are still faster and more maneuverable.
Absolutely. Anything from you on that, Barry, at all?
Yeah, the UAP task force report was released during the summertime, and it made what I thought were some pretty remarkable conclusions in saying that the phenomenon was real and it was a national security threat. I had decided that 40 years ago when I wrote The Intent with Larry Fawcett, that the documents then alluded to national security threats and a certainly genuine phenomenon, but even more so, I wrote a commentary on the task force report, and one of the things that had been included at the end was a letter that was written in 1947 and signed by General Nathan Twining, for the Air Force, and he was saying the phenomenon was real and not fictitious, and there was great concern about it. That was at the dawn of the modern flying saucer era. It's amazing how 70 plus years have passed, and they're pretty much acknowledging that the phenomenon is doing the same thing it did back then.
Yes, I had Kevin Randall on right the day that they released that, or the week, I should say, that they released that. He said you could almost go, cut and paste from the Twining in a lot of ways. It's almost like a remake of that. Just letting the listener know, I have a very interesting guest coming up. He's a professor emeritus of art in Arizona. His name is Alfred. I have his last name. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but I'll know that by the show. He'll be on October 19th. And he had 2 encounters in 1966 in Vietnam while he was aboard the USS Wedderburn. So this is he's going to be the first time that he's speaking out about that. That's coming up in October 19th. So there are many, many military encounters. I'm very excited to have someone talk that was involved in the Vietnam War and is going to be talking about an encounter. I can't wait for that. So that's coming up in October, on October 19th. And so what about people I mentioned earlier? I know you actually have someone that traveled from the East Coast there, just arrived just before the show. And welcome, I'll say, Jay, welcome. I know you're listening in. So does that happen a lot? Do you get people from all over, visiting from all over?
Yeah, that's one of the wonderful things, is not only being able to assemble all this material, but make it available to researchers and interested parties, as well as production groups and media, I might add. About 2 months ago now, I believe it's been, time flies, we had Ross Coulthard here filming for his 7 News Spotlight documentary, The Phenomenon. And in fact, I was sitting right here with Ross, and was really, it was a pleasure meeting him. He was really a true gentleman, true professional, and was really happy to be part of that production, which I think really had high production value, to be quite honest, compared to most we see out. And Ross takes the subject extremely seriously. I can assure you, from having very lengthy private conversations with him. But, they want to be able to talk about the history. They want to be able to show the history. And, something that I think Barry and Jan and I have discussed in the last week or so, it's great that we want to digitize this information. And by the way, I want to mention, we've also been working collaboratively with Rod Dyke up in Seattle, who has a vast UFO historical archive. So I've kind of termed us the 4 amigos in this whole endeavor. And we were just discussing with Rod that, it's really important to digitize it. But for production crews, the last thing they want to see is an aging researcher sitting in front of a computer pulling up PDFs. They love to see that tattered government document stamped top secret or confidential, then crossed out, and then have the actual blue pen signature and have, the patina to that old paper.
Yep.
That's great for production value. They want those visual elements to help tell that story. And so, yes, it's great we're digitizing, but it's also important to have these original documents, especially when people question, you're saying this, where did you get it from? And it's so gratifying to pull out that government document, the original from 1952, and say, here it is.
I love that. That's the type of thing I'm into, as my background has a lot to do with that. So I'm going to ask people in chat. There's not going to be any phone calls today. We just don't have that capability. But for people in chat that want to pose a question, please put it in all caps to make sure that I'll catch it. But here's one from Facebook that came in. So just why are they listed as a security threat when they have never been hostile towards the military? Anyone want to tackle that?
Well, they have. When I did Clear Intent, there were all sorts of indications of missile-based, nuclear-based penetrations by lights, helicopters, unknown helicopters, I should say, unknown aircraft. And at one point, the government had declared a security option 3 alert for all of these intrusions. And I had tried to find what was at the bottom of all of these seemingly nefarious activities. Military was extremely upset with it. But to this day, we haven't located any final report on it. If one was written, it's being well hidden. And there are all sorts of incidents through history of military jet and aircraft chasing strange objects, sometimes shooting at them, unsuccessfully, obviously, or I think we would have had the answer to the phenomenon by now. But still, the national security threat has existed since the early days of the topic, and it's still there according to the UAP task force.
I think we need to qualify that, though, Martin, and we need to insert potential threat. It has to be viewed as a potential threat if you have unknown aerial vehicles performing exotic flight characteristics that can fly rings around your state-of-the-art aircraft that are violating military airspace, commercial airspace, coming dangerously close to military assets and commercial air traffic. It has to be viewed as a potential threat until they have a better understanding of what they're dealing with.
Go ahead. Yep.
In 1960, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena sent a confidential report to Congress. Every congressman, every senator got one. One of the lead cases in there was about a transport aircraft, military transport aircraft, flying over the Pacific. It's not in Blue Book. However, NICAP got a copy somewhere. It was not classified. They got a copy. It's in the files. It's in the U.S. Intelligence Command at Fort Eustis. That's where we found that. It's also in Keogh's book because he got a copy of it and he put it in this report. The pilot says, "I felt I had been fired upon."
Wow.
And they picked it up on radar also. So they almost had, in 1960-61, they almost had congressional hearings on that, because one of the things is, at the time, the reaction time for, to launch missiles and aircraft was very low, and as far as detecting an attack, it was you didn't have that much lead time. It's not much better now, but the NICAP thing was a UFO could be mistaken for an attack, and we could be launching a counterstrike based on the way these UFOs act, especially if they're coming over the poles towards the United States. So they almost had congressional hearings then. They had the Armed Forces Subcommittee in '65 actually do hearings, and then they had a seminar in the Astronautic Science Committee later on in '68, I think it was.
Interesting. Getting back just quickly, I failed to mention that a guest that's going to be on that had the encounters, one of them, the craft was right over the deck, and they decided to fire upon it, fired tracer bullets, which were ricocheting and bouncing back to the deck, and they all had to take cover. It's going to be that's going to be a very interesting talk on the 19th. So one of the thoughts I have now, these are just thoughts, and I'd like to get your opinions on this thought, is that most likely, in my opinion, the military doesn't really know what this is, and they may be a little bit agitated that it's getting so much attention, because they can't promise us that they can protect us from whatever it is. And if they say we don't know and we can't, we have no idea what's going on, I just think that there's only so much that's going to come out for that reason. I wondered if anyone would like to talk about your own opinion on that.
Oh, I'm sure that there are many, many hidden incidents out there that we'll never hear about. I believe documents have already been destroyed relating to UFO reports. I recall a reproduction of one in the publication of NICAP, where it was clearly marked for destruction. That, as far as I know, it was never released. Other reports have been said to suddenly disappeared out of the files. I can't find them anymore. If you file FOIA requests, mysteriously they're gone. There are indications in the released files of numerous documents relating to sensitive incidents that haven't been released in subsequent FOIA requests specifically for them. Again, they're gone, whether they were destroyed or misplaced or stuffed under an auditorium stage somewhere at a military base. It's hard to say, but there's certainly a lot of information missing.
I've gone through a lot of UFO cases and looked at reference documents or things like that. I have 1,100, my database is 1,100 cases. We also have the each intelligence report that goes through the Pentagon used to be, it still is, serial numbered, and they produce a reference. Now it's carried on computers, so we can't get at it. But it used to be on little index cards about this size, and it had the serial number, the title of the case, where it came from, what classification it was, who, some places where it went to. The CIA got 5 copies of every case that came through the Pentagon, and then they say, oh, we only have 900 pages. Anyways, the database is nowhere close to complete. And you have to look at every report and see if there's a reference to another report. And the database, if we had more people working on it, the database would grow. Now I was able to go down to the archives, the National Archives in Washington. They have collections of intelligence reports and withdraw a number of these reports. They're not in Blue Book. Sometimes we find out they are in Blue Book, but they're mislabeled, or the way Blue Book titled them is different than the way the case is titled on the index card. So it's a sifting thing to find these things. Sometimes we find out that, like 1947 January says mystery sightings in Greenland. It's nothing about UFOs. You would think maybe it would, but it doesn't contain a thing about UFOs. It's other subjects, intelligence subjects. But in a lot of cases, I've come up with new reports that somehow never got into Blue Book for some reason.
Yeah, Martin, I think with regard to the subject, the fundamental question that we should all be asking, and it's amazing how many UFO researchers don't even ask this question in light of the Pentagon report: why now? Why now are we having a 180-degree turn with regard to their position regarding the subject? That is the fundamental question we should all be asking, and I think that is really at the heart of the matter. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theorists within the UFO community. For those that know me, I am not one of them. I prefer to look for verifiable, factual, well-documented evidence. And it's interesting, the conspiracy theorists, whether UFOs or otherwise, they always view or frame the government as in the know. The government knows what's going on, and they're keeping it secret. The government recovered the crashed vehicle in Roswell. We back engineered it. We know why they're here. We're now back engineering UFOs, and that's all this advanced technology. They give the government too much credit, with all due respect, all conspiracy theorists. I believe the quote-unquote government cover-up, based on 31 years of investigating the subject, and I would defer to my colleagues to get their opinion on this, all indicators point to the fact they don't know what they're dealing with. Yes, they know there's something there. They don't know what it is. But going back to what I said, why now are they having this change in attitude towards the subject publicly, not in private, but publicly? I think the answer might lie in the 2019 Navy spokesman statements, when they, if you recall, came out with a news article that stated they are now formulating official policy and procedures for naval personnel to report UAPs. It goes on to state in that article, and I think this might be a little glimmer into the rationale behind all of this, they stated due to the increased frequency that they are seeing with regard to UAP phenomenon within restricted military operations areas. I'm just going to put forth this idea. I could be completely wrong. What if they're seeing this increase, this ever increasing trend of activity around military operations areas? And what if that trend continues? It's going to get to a point, if that trend continues, where trying to dispel the subject, cover up the subject is untenable. They're not going to be able to do it. So to use the old government term, rather than the tail wag the dog, I think they want to get ahead of the messaging and be in control of the messaging with regard to the subject.
Yeah. Another thing, too, I am very curious about the fact that the Navy is taking the lead on all of this. What happened to the Air Force?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering that myself. It's very strange. I thought of that.
Supposed to be covering a lot more of the skies than perhaps the Navy.
And the Army. Even the Army was open to one thing.
The Air Force held sway over it for many, many years, and now the Navy's in charge. We haven't heard much of anything from the Air Force, except in the task force report, it says that they've recently started to coordinate their information.
Yeah.
But we haven't seen a flicker of that yet.
To Barry's point, Martin, he brings up a really good point, because also it's very interesting when you look at the conclusions of the Pentagon report and contrast that with the three conclusions that justified shutting down Blue Book. For those that may recall, one of the conclusions of Project Blue Book, no UFO has demonstrated any threat to national security. Fast forward to 2021, as Barry alluded to earlier, they stated that UAPs may constitute a threat to national security and air safety. So you have a complete contradiction, the Navy versus the Air Force. They also go on to state in Blue Book, one of the conclusions, that UFOs haven't demonstrated any physical characteristics or properties that regarding scientific principles that we don't understand. If you read between the lines in the Pentagon report, they're suggesting we don't know how these things are operating, and they clearly show some type of exotic physics that's at play as far as how they fly. So there's yet another contradiction comparing the Navy to the Air Force. And so I know people were disappointed in that there wasn't much meat to the report, but two things we got to remember. A, it's a preliminary report. And the second point is, this is an unclassified preliminary report. Those on Capitol Hill within the Senate Intelligence Committees are certainly seeing more information. But I've always said since this report's come out, if you were disappointed, you had your expectations set too high. I did a live Russian television news back in January, and they asked me, what should we expect? And I said in January, and thank God I was proven right, because anytime you make a prediction, usually you're going to eat crow later. I stated that I think we all need to temper our expectations accordingly. And that was the best wisdom that I could give people at the time. But, you know, there were the sensationalists, the pseudo researchers out there saying, oh, they're going to wheel out the crashed UFO from Roswell. It's going to be disclosure with a capital D. And I just sat back and drank my coffee and just tried to just temper my expectations accordingly and wait for the report. And justifiably, I think we were right in tempering those expectations.
Oh, the task force report mentioned 144 UFO incidents collected since 2004. One was identified.
Right.
That's far and away higher than any figure the Air Force had as explained reports. I mean, I believe the Air Force's final statistics were somewhere around 5% unexplained.
Yeah.
And then the Condon Committee, which was supposed to wrap up Air Force investigations by using a scientific study to close down Project Blue Book, they did a case analysis that revealed about somewhere around 30% unknowns. Now we're up to 99-point-something% of that are unexplained. This is, to me, a rather serious problem.
Of course, during the Vietnam War, there were at least two projects in Vietnam. They were kept from the Condon Committee, and they were kept from Project Blue Book. One was called Have Fear, and they used specialized sensors to detect UFOs, And they upped the standard for what was a UFO, and almost all of their cases were reportedly unknown. So this is amazing, and this was hidden from the people that are supposedly studying UFOs at the time, the Condon Committee.
Interesting. I've mentioned this on the show probably 20 times and probably boring the listener for every week, but I did have an insurance agent, a broker at my house back in the 1990s before I was ever looking at this topic. And he said he was in a special segment of the Air Force during Vietnam that was studying UFOs. And I never got any details. I've never been able to reach him again. And I'd like to. I thought I found his name, but I can't find any information on him. Go ahead.
Yeah, in 2015, I was browsing the National Archives website for information, just nothing in particular, but I came across a listing for combat air activity reports during Vietnam, and I always like to check that out to see if there's anything unusual there. And I was shocked to find that there were numerous references to graphed out reports, some of which were called UFOs. And I said, wait a minute, we didn't hear much about Vietnam over the years, a few times in the press, but here were combat reports talking about it. So the more I looked, the more we found. I filled 2 binders full of document releases about Vietnam, not just from the National Archives, but I checked a few academic sources that had stored old Vietnam War government papers, and the reports are in there too.
You know, what's interesting, Martin, about Vietnam, just to kind of, since we have Barry Greenwood here, there's an interesting correlation between UFO reports in Vietnam and UFO reports during the 75 overflights of the ICBM missile sites. In both instances, they were referring to them as mystery helicopters.
Yeah.
A friend of mine was a medic in Vietnam, and he actually talked to one of the fighter pilots, and he came back and described the unusual lights that they were seeing. And he said, we were calling them mystery helicopters because they had the ability to hover, unlike an aircraft, but then they could rapidly accelerate and disappear. And I believe I'm correct in my friend saying that the Viet Cong didn't have any helicopters.
Yeah, the authorities found it hard to believe it was North Vietnamese activity because of the way the lights behaved.
Yeah.
We had the same thing in 1975 near the military bases where helicopter-like objects were seen, but they couldn't be clearly identified as such. And once, at least at Loring Air Force Base, they wanted to shine a searchlight on the object that was hovering over nuclear storage units, and they were afraid to blind the pilot, whoever the pilot was, that they might crash into one of the bomb igloos and destroy it. Well, what happened was they tried to identify as clearly as possible what these were, and eventually they shot off towards Canada. The aircraft were in pursuit. They couldn't catch up with these. I mean, it's hard to believe that jet aircraft couldn't catch helicopters.
I think those were Phantom jets too, weren't they? If I remember.
Yes. Yeah, they were. There was a unit out of Plattsburgh that went after these things, and they couldn't identify them. And we never heard anything about the Canadian end of it. If they shot off into Canada, where was Canada's security with these objects? It penetrated U.S. military bases. Canada should be worried, but nothing. There's nothing out of Canada about it.
Amazing. Getting back to a comment you made, David, I had right after December 16, 2017, the New York Times article came out. The following week, I had Stanton Friedman on along with Kathy Martin, and I basically, titled the show "Stan Friedman Weighs In on the Pentagon, release of videos, etc." And the first thing he said in that interview, and that's my most listened to YouTube video out there, but the first thing he said was, "Why now? Why now?" That's my number one question.
We need to be asking that question because any government they don't do things arbitrarily. They do things for a reason. They do things with intent. And I think that really speaks to the larger overarching issue of what's going on behind the scenes with regard to the subject. What do they know, and why are they suddenly having this sea change in relation to how they're dealing publicly with the subject?
Right. I've said oftentimes on this show, many times, just my opinion, that, and you kind of echoed that, David, and that's the government probably doesn't know any more than we do. But do you think there's some argument to make that they may know some more, or do you believe in general they don't know? Anyone?
Yeah, potentially I think they know more than we do, but that doesn't necessarily mean where these things are coming from, why they're here, what's their intent. I mean, those big questions may still be elusive, but I would like to believe, with, as Barry alluded to, satellite imagery that's capturing these things based on Radcliffe's testimony as well as the Pentagon's own report. This is not supposition on my part. This is what the Pentagon report states. Multiple sensors have tracked these things. The Aegis radar system with the 2004 Nimitz incident, satellite imagery, infrared. We have these things tracked on ground-based radar, airborne radar, ground-based visual, airborne visual. I would hope that based on the various sensing apparatus that they have, as well as undersea sonar buoys that are detecting these USOs, and I know that through a friend that has a friend in the Navy that told me this, that they have a lot of information, and they probably have a little bit more specificity as far as what's going on than we do. But I do feel, and again, speculation, those larger overarching questions of who are these things, where are they from, why are they here, they're no closer to those answers than we are.
Yeah, I think they have more detail, but they don't have conclusions, and all that detail we haven't seen yet.
Right.
So Cora Lorenzen, the head of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, as a feminist perspective, she said, Daddy won't tell, but Daddy doesn't know, and Daddy has more and better information than we do, but they don't know. So, and of course, she was very much into UFOs. She's the head of that organization. They got, many UFO reports. And Dr. James McDonald, a physicist at the University of Arizona, said, I think UFOs are a follow-up and then a cover-up of the follow-up. And there's a book coming out called The Unidentified, and that's the author's conclusion that this was an intelligence failure almost from the beginning. The Air Force wanted to claim possession of this, and if the CIA came in, they fought the Air Force. In an interview with Wendell Smith, who was Air Force intelligence, it was decades afterwards, and he was still angry about the CIA sticking their nose into UFOs. He said, what did they have their business on this? Well, the intelligence community works best when they all cooperate together. And this is an intelligence failure here.
And Martin, if I can add to what Jan just said, a colleague, Chris Mellon, and I know your audience is familiar with Chris. He's been very prominent since all of this has come forward. Chris Mellon has made an interesting statement publicly and in private to myself with regard to the fact that, and I think it's rather chilling when you think about it, that he was frustrated that within the intelligence networks, there was no centralization of information. You had disparate groups within the intelligence community that were sitting on UFO or UAP data, but nobody was centralizing it. And it was an interesting comparison he made. He said it was almost akin to what I saw prior to 9/11. All these various groups were collecting chatter, but they weren't making sense out of it because no one was sharing and centralizing that information. And to Jan's point, I think that we're seeing now, due to successive public statements and documents in light of the Pentagon report, that there are efforts to now centralize this information. And I think we, as the American public, should feel much safer in that, because at the end of the day, they're viewing this UFO UAP subject through the lens of national security. And the earlier question, Martin, by one of your audience members, and I understand the question when they say, why are they viewing this as a threat? We have to understand the audience. These people, their job is tasked with the defense of this country. So, of course, they're going to view UFOs through the lens of national security. And again, as I mentioned earlier, view it as a potential threat until they know better.
I need to say something. I misspoke. I said Wendell Stevens, who was in the Air Force, but the man that I was talking about was Wendon. Yeah, it wasn't the famous guy with UFO photographs.
Oh yes, he had that big, huge
Here in the
collection.
Southwest. No, it wasn't him. It was somebody that was in the top of U.S. Air Force intelligence.
Well, we have to take a quick break in just like 3 minutes. But speaking of that, I know that Open Minds owns that collection of photographs from Stevens. And I'm just wondering, David, have you ever thought about reaching out to see if they would want them in your archives?
I haven't reached out, mainly because I've had enough to contend with as it is currently, to be brutally honest, Martin.
Sure.
But I do believe, and Barry and Jan might be able to correct me, I think some of that went to the archives for UFO research, didn't it, over in Sweden?
It seems like a little bit of everything goes to the archives for UFO
Yeah, I think
research.
some of that has been dispersed over time. But to your point, Open Minds, with the death of Wendell Stevens, did initially acquire it. But I think some of that has been parsed out to various groups. And it's great the work we're doing here, but it's also great with the work of AFU in Sweden and all of these other groups across the globe, because there shouldn't be one location for all UFO history. We should have respective archives, ideally in every country, because at the end of the day, it's part of that country's history.
Yeah, can you imagine collecting UFO history in one building and suddenly a spark takes effect and the whole thing goes up in smoke?
Yeah, that would be like that ancient library that was burned.
Right.
Alexandria.
Right.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking of. Yes. All right. So I think we're going to go into, we do have another question in chat, but this has been very interesting so far. And this is the first part of the show. We're going to be heading into a quick break. And when this is over at KGRA Radio, hang in there. We'll be right back right after these messages. All right, we are back. And
I came back from Germany.
Whoop. Okay, we are back. And my guests tonight are Jan Aldrich, David Marler, and Barry Greenwood. We're all having a very good chat about basically historical UFOs and all that. We're going to get into other subjects as we go along. And if you're listening live and in chat, please put your questions in caps and I'll try to get to them. All right, welcome back. There you are. And I just have to fix things. Here we go.
Here we are.
Welcome back. All right. And your audio is on, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we had a question I wanted to pull up for you, and that is this one came in. What is the best evidence you have collected? And I know your collection is massive. Could you actually point the finger at one thing and say it's like that has got to be the best UFO evidence?
Well, I don't know if we really have evidence here as such, rather reports of cases. Barry,
Well, I have a copy of Joe Simonson's pancake from 1961. I think that's pretty cool.
That's definitely evidence.
you have to tell the story on that one real quick.
Well, basically, Joe Simonson was in contact with extraterrestrials that landed in his yard, and
Oh, yes.
that's
Yes.
an old, very old case.
Yeah.
Very argued over, but it involved him giving some water to these creatures in exchange for what seemed to be pancakes, and he waved those around to people and showed them that he had pieces of extraterrestrial food apparently, and the organization NICAP, as they had to do with UFO incidents, looked into it, and I'm sure they were skeptical about it, but they had a local investigator up there obtain a piece of a pancake for analysis, and they had determined that it seemed to be terrestrial, nothing special about it, and the piece ended up in their files, and many years went by. Eventually, an investigator, Ted Blocher, who had a project to study humanoid reports, gave his files up. He was moving on to other things, and he asked me if I would take his HumCat files, as he called them. And I did, and I rearranged them and all. And I came across this one file on Eagle River, Wisconsin, which was that story. And I was shocked when I opened it up. I found an envelope, and there was wax paper inside. And wax paper wrapped up a piece of this pancake that NICAP had talked about, and became a sort of a cause célèbre for a lot of UFO believers. But it wasn't evidence of extraterrestrials at all. But it's just a really cool artifact. I've been tempted to taste it with a little maple syrup, but
Yeah.
I'd probably be costing myself a lot of money.
Yeah, that's right. Put it in the microwave first and put a little butter on it.
Yeah, it's pretty hard.
Well,
So some real evidence, please.
Okay.
Brad Sparks and I have been looking for broadcasting UFOs. And one of the first cases was all the way back in 51, Larson Air Force Base. And they have, military aircraft have coded recognition signals. So you send out a recognition signal, and then the aircraft sends you back using a computer thing. It'll send you back a classified saying, "This is who I am." And so they did that with this case in Larson Air Force Base that Ruppelt talks about in his book, but he doesn't mention that they send out the coded signal, and the UFO replied with a coded signal. So how does it have that code? Well, one might say, oh, it's just a secret mission going on that the people at Larson didn't know. It apparently at one time this case was top secret and had been downgraded and given to Blue Book. There's a number of other cases like that in the file where they're receiving transmissions of something, and they don't include enough information in the report for you to do something. But it would seem to me that obviously that would be something they're very interested in.
And Martin, related to the question, regarding evidence, and I wrote about this in my book, it really depends on what you define as evidence.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking physical evidence of a UFO or an extraterrestrial, we don't have that. And I would challenge anyone who says they have that to bring that forth to the scientific community to analyze. But really what we do, as I mentioned earlier, is we have decades worth of military civilian reports. The ones that are most compelling to get to the question is the cases that involve radar in addition to visual sightings, where you have objective measures that are supporting the subjective human perception. And there's many compelling cases where many of these objects have been detected on multiple radar systems, in addition to being seen by multiple trained military observers.
The best evidence we have is the evidence of it being an unexplained phenomenon. Not much beyond that. It's just a weird phenomenon that is tough to define. There's plenty of evidence of that in terms of the reports, but if you're talking about artifacts, you can't point at any one thing and say it's from space or other dimensions or whatever.
Yeah.
It's
nothing in the civilian sector.
No.
So we have. I'm interested in close encounter cases where there's some kind of effect, like stalling cars, turning out the lights, things like that. Now there's almost 2,000 of these cases that we know of, and in almost just 1 or 2 cases has the car been brought in to be examined afterwards. I mean, they say, oh, we took it to a mechanic and he said, I can't figure out why it would do that. But it hasn't actually been well investigated. Condon Committee, Roy Craig went out and he had a compass and he ran the compass over the hood of the car. That is not a scientific investigation. The guys in Britain brought a car in and they tore it apart to look at what was different about it afterwards. In a lot of cases, it burns out the fuses.
Wow.
So it's this is something that somebody with some scientific acumen could actually examine, but it is seldom has it been that.
And to Jan's point, getting back to what I alluded to earlier, Martin, with regard to looking at patterns in the data, you can take the ground vehicle interference cases and then look at characteristics that also match other cases. One that I think of is 1973 Mansfield, Ohio, the Colonel Coyne case, where this military helicopter was caught in this light that actually pulled it up, despite the fact that they were in a downward trajectory, according to the controls in the helicopter. But in the days, weeks, and months following that, that helicopter became the hangar queen. They had all kinds of electronic failures with that helicopter, and the only thing that they can tie it to was a direct result of it being in the beam of this UFO. So to Jan's point, it's not just ground vehicles, but even airborne vehicles that have sustained some type of damage as a result of being in close proximity to these UFOs. And
what do you think? You keep hearing about the metamaterials, the possible crash artifacts that may or may not exist. I don't know. I personally, it's in the gray basket for me whether these things, even though some pretty high up there people, including Lou Elizondo, kind of hints to the fact that these things are known to exist. And what are any comments on that from any one of you? And I'm going to be pulling up questions on chat right after that.
As I said, I don't know of any artifacts that have proven to be anything that would substantiate UFOs as something really exotic. Metamaterials, well, hints are okay, but we're not seeing any information.
Yeah.
And that none of it's really come out except for generalities in the last few years since it first surfaced.
Yeah, I'm like you, Martin. I'm pretty much an agnostic when it comes to that. Not denying that they don't exist, and I hope they do exist, because I think we all want physical evidence of something that is suggested that this is someone else's technology. But if there is physical evidence, I would compel whoever has that material to bring it forth to the general scientific community, so it can be researched and studied at multiple independent laboratories, because that's what we do, right, in science.
Yeah.
We get multiple groups to analyze the data, and then we compare the results. And so it's interesting that they're talking about it. I just wish that they would afford the general scientific community the access to those materials.
So Bigelow had certain things that were sent to him or that his people collected during the during his subcontract investigation. The University of Las Vegas, UNLV, examined some of those things, and they were all mostly mundane, including a jar of muddy water. So now they did it for free. They wanted Bigelow to give them more business, but nothing that they did in the initial examination of what he had submitted was anything that was exotic. And that story died really quickly because there was no oomph behind it.
Sure. I remember the story about Art's Parts. I think Linda Moulton Howe
Right.
had them as well. And one of them ended up being a part to a car radiator. You know, I mean, the metal. I don't know if any of you followed any of that, but that
Right.
was
Yes.
that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So here's a question directly for you, David. Why Belgium for the late 80s, 90s triangle flap?
Well, that's a good question. I really obviously don't know, and I don't think the Belgian Air Force knows after all these decades. But what's interesting is you look at the 80s and the 90s, actually it was 89 to 91, really, respectively, that wave of sightings that they're referencing. Leading up to that, and I've had discussions with researchers in Wales and England about this, is starting around 1983, going around to 1986, in Wales, you were having sightings in January of 83 specifically. I'm working with a group right now in Wales that's doing a documentary on this. There was a wave of triangular UFO sightings over Wales. And when you look, and again, this is where I talk about the big picture, Martin, looking at patterns in the data. You look at that, and it's almost as if the activity tended to shift to the southeast, down towards the English Channel. You started getting all of these reports in southern England. And then within literally weeks of the Belgian wave, you now suddenly had that activity shift to Belgium, apparently from England. Despite that, there were still sightings going on in England. But when you look at the distance across the English Channel by air, that's nothing. And so
30 miles or something, yeah.
We see these patterns of activity that seem to shift. And so, again, Belgium wasn't isolated, although I would argue it wasn't the Belgian UFO sightings that were unique, rather the way that the media and the Belgian military approached it and discussed it publicly. Much different than the United States Air Force take on the UFO subject.
And what about the controversial photo that looked so good?
Yeah.
I know it's has not been able to been replicated as well. It's kind of a mystery.
Yeah, well, I always say this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of the lead investigator, Patrick Ferren, a friend of mine, and the lead investigator with SOBEPS, now COBEPS, but it was called SOBEPS at that time. And they did the lead investigations. He knows the photographer. And in their opinion, in Patrick's opinion, and their experts, it was, in fact, a hoaxed photo. And it's interesting, though, because I always love to use this as an example of how skeptics will take one thing and generalize it to a ridiculous degree. They'll say, you see, the photo, the famous photo was a fake, therefore there's no validity to any of the sightings.
Exactly.
Which is ridiculous. That's like saying I have a counterfeit $20 bill, therefore all the $20 bills that you're holding in your wallets and purses are counterfeit.
Exactly. Yeah, that is kind of frustrating. Well, the old saying that throwing the baby out with the bathwater seems to happen quite a bit when it comes to these. I'm going to pull up that image as soon as I can get that up because it really is a fascinating. I mean, you look at the picture, and you really think there has to be something.
Yeah.
It ends up it's not. But also, I remember speaking to Leslie Kane about this, and she said that there was, I believe, the person that took the photo appeared to have gotten a payoff of some kind, which made it even more unusual. Do you know anything?
I don't know about a payoff, but anytime you enter money into the equation on these situations, it certainly calls into question what's the motivation.
Yeah, exactly. Everything I'm trying to pull up on that photo is not coming through, but it really is. It's quite a convincing photo when you first look at it, for sure. And let's see, I have another question that Mary Grace always has some great questions, and I'm going to pull that up here as soon as I get to it here. And that is, are there any documents from any governments in the world that claim they know who or what they are? Are you aware of any?
Not official documents that I know of. There are fakes running around that look like government documents that surely say that.
Yeah.
But I've always asked with government paperwork and all, one thing I insisted on if they were released by any government, they should be accompanied by a paper trail, provenance, cover letters, anything like that. Documents that leak out don't impress me.
Right.
I can't trust them.
Right.
I don't know where they're coming from. They came from anonymous sources sometimes, or they went through third, fourth, fifth parties. And you can't really determine the origin of these things.
Right.
And that automatically makes documents suspicious.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I would like to talk about what was floating around, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, and there was so much hubbub about it. And I didn't think it had any meat to it at all when I looked into it. I could be wrong, so I try to be open-minded. But the Wilson document, are you anyone familiar with that?
Yes.
And your opinion?
Well, Wilson said that he wasn't there. He denied it. So it's one piece of evidence after another. He said, she said. Now the government is known to lie about UFOs everywhere. So, but I don't trust the supposed outcome of that. What supposedly was discussed and things like that.
Yeah, I would ask, where did it come from?
Yeah.
Right. And, well, that supposedly that originated in a file that belonged to the astronaut. Who am I thinking of?
Edgar Mitchell.
Exactly. Yes. And I don't know if that's, and then supposedly it was taken to Australia and kind of got around from there. And, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I mean, that's what I know of it.
That's pretty roundabout.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I did a conference with Edgar Mitchell and Firmage. Edgar Mitchell is an American hero, and he's definitely knows what he's talking about as far as NASA goes. But I have a lot of trouble with things that he says, and it's kind of hard for me to believe some of the things that he says. And he always leaves himself a loophole to jump out of. So you might say it's interesting, but not. We don't have the complete story. That's what I'd say there.
Yeah, Martin, I would just say that the Wilson document is no different than the purported MJ-12 documents and others that have surfaced. If you believe that they're real, it's incumbent upon you to prove that they're valid, not on us to prove that they're not valid.
Right.
And
yeah, exactly. Yes.
So, and I know with your background and what you do, provenance is everything.
Yes.
And so, Barry Greenwood wrote one of the best books on the subject. I just told him yesterday, I said, yours is one of my top 10 books. I said, I'm not just blowing sunshine up your backside when I say that. I have a newspaper article from several years ago where I listed my top 10 books, and his is listed on there. But the reason I said that is there was a lot of spurious material being printed at that time.
Oh, yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, and I know, knowing Barry and having seen the documents that he's worked on, he went to the archives. He went and filed FOIA requests. He can demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt these documents are legitimate and this is where they came from. And if you don't believe me, file a FOIA request on these same documents and you'll get what I got.
Here's the thing. At the time we were working on the documents, I wanted to obtain credible material. I wanted to get them directly from the agencies and all, not through anonymous sources that you couldn't trust. to make a case that there was something to the UFO phenomenon. And we were getting all those documents. And that doesn't mean that because something's in a government file that the information in it is absolutely genuine. They had information about hoax stories in government records. They certainly are not real. But at least you have the chance to assess the information once it's released officially to determine where they were getting their information from and how credible it was. So we were trying to build a case that the documents proved that there was an unexplained phenomenon. And then suddenly, after that became popular, that FOIAs were discussed in the press, and the overflights and other military type incidents were getting into the newspapers, people started issuing hoaxes, fake documents from wherever. The distinguishing feature of them was they weren't coming from official sources. And it was tainting the water in this whole controversy. I was trying to build a case, and these people are trying to shoot it down for whatever self-promoting purpose they had. We had to spend a great deal of time examining these documents and pulling them apart to see what they were all about. And it was very disappointing to have to do that, because I wanted to spend that time on legitimate, serious research. I was forced to examine these things because they were being given equal or maybe more than equal treatment by the outside world. And we had to explain, this isn't what you think it is.
Right.
And Martin, if I could just add to that briefly,
sure.
We're talking in the context of documents, but I would, ask your audience, when you're going to UFO conferences, when you're listening to other podcasts with different people on, you should be asking the same question, not only of documents and their origins, some of the ridiculous and spurious claims made by pseudo researchers in the field that are spouting the most ridiculous minutia. You should be asking, where are you getting this information? Show me where you got this information, because too often in this field, we have, again, I call them pseudo researchers that are all about sensationalism, and they're constantly quoting unnamed sources. I can't, my source translated, you can't verify what I'm telling you. I mean, that's how I interpret it. And admittedly, there are sensitive people in sensitive positions that have to be careful. But when you have researchers that are consistently, where it's the rule, not the exception, saying, well, I got this from an unnamed source, I have to question that. And for those that have attended my lectures at conferences, the one thing that I get complimented on more than anything, Martin, and it's gratifying, they say, I always love your presentations because at the bottom of every PowerPoint slide, you have your source.
Yes. And let me ask you this. How much of what you were talking about, Barry, earlier, how much of this would you think, or is any of it, could possibly be disinformation? And I know when you're mixing things in, a lot of times, the disinformation works really great when there's a little sliver of truth mixed in with the batch.
Well, MJ12 was a slight example of that, because around 1980, there was an incident reported in New Mexico, Manzana weapons storage area. Documents were explaining how UFOs were seen, and
not very far from here.
Right, it's very close to where I am now. But these papers were written up, and there was a special agent who was looking into them. His name figured prominently in these papers, Richard Doty, who I'm familiar now. But he looked into these reports while he was still with OSI. And one day I was watching television, and there was a documentary on, I think it was a San Francisco program called the UFO Experience. And towards the end of it, they showed documents which were about this very same series of events. And they were flashed for an unusual amount of time. I was videotaping the program, and I was able to freeze frame it and take down some of the information. And I used that information to file a FOIA request on the documents. They looked genuine. They looked like government documents and all. And I thought maybe we could get more than what we're shown. So a short time later, I did receive a FOIA release from the Air Force containing these documents. But the odd thing was that they looked a little different. They weren't the exact same documents. The markings were different from the ones on the television and all. And as time went along, it became evident that this Doty fellow was involved with the subject far more deeply than anyone realized. He wasn't just an AFOSI investigator, but he was involved in other stories too. It seems to be traceable all the way back to a hoax from Ellsworth Air Force Base in the late 70s. But apparently what he was doing was he was creating information about UFO sightings and mixing it in with fiction, and getting the documents filed officially with an OSI.
Really?
And it was meant to be shown somewhere so that someone could file a request and get an official release of these planted documents.
God.
And that's what happened in this case. I was the unwitting dupe, I think they called me one time. They wanted someone to file a FOIA request, and there I was doing it for them. I had no idea what was going on, obviously, but that's what happened.
They called him a useful idiot.
The useful idiot, yeah, right.
Right. So
We can all be that at some point.
So Ellsworth Air Force Base, Robert Todd wrote to every unit on Ellsworth Air Force Base, every unit, and at the Pentagon, the top supervisors of these types of units. So you went from the bottom to the top. Everybody at Ellsworth Air Force Base said this never happened, including, and then the Pentagon information came in. Every supervisor of this, like the missile supervisor, the maintenance supervisors, the MP supervisors, and AFOSI, Office of Special Investigations, all denied that those documents were real. So it's pretty well covered as to whether these documents have any provenance. One of the things I think Todd got a letter that said that we're investigating where they possibly came from. But yeah, it was. So it's there's people inside the military that misbehave too.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, and I'm sure you can learn a lot from the disinformation. I mean, just kind of when I say learn a lot, maybe you can try to figure out what they're trying to do and what is the outcome they're trying to reach. And
but yeah, here's another thing about Doty and being involved in that story too. The motivation can be different things behind it. I wrote a paper in 2007 with Brad Sparks, and we discussed that whole business with Doty and Paul Benowitz and later MJ12 developments, and we'd come to different conclusions about it. He thought it was coming down from people in AFOSI and perhaps higher than that as a disinformation campaign. I heard evidence repeatedly from participants in the story, not necessarily military people, but that there was a money motivation behind it. What a lot of people don't know is that MJ12 had its very, very early origins in a fiction novel that was written by some of the participants, Doty, Bill Moore, and Robert Pratt, who was a reporter for the National Enquirer. And he was he didn't necessarily believe the story. He was just writing it up as fiction.
Uh-huh.
And when word leaked out about MJ12 and all, he was pretty adamant that there was nothing to it. But there was this manuscript, which was the property of 3 different people, and it couldn't circulate. So it was hard to prove anything. But he was the writer, one of the writers of it, and he asserted that it was nonsense. So to me, it was money that was behind that. They wanted to cash in on a story. Started as fiction, but they turned it into alleged fact. And they went pretty far with it. They were on television, and you remember the UFO Cover-Up Live show? That was pretty,
Not myself, but
and the strawberry ice cream and Tibetan music and all kinds of bizarre claims. So,
Disinformation. That's a Soviet word. Now, I've had people tell me, you know, this office symbol on Colonel Weaver's letters, that's Air Force's disinformation organization. I said, you know what? You're showing great ignorance. Disinformation is a Soviet word. It's not an American word. And there is, you know, OPSEC, where you don't tell people what's going on, or you give them a cover story. But the word is not used in the U.S. military lexicon, except referring to the Soviets or the Russians or other people overseas. We don't have a department of disinformation, and Colonel Weaver, who was in charge of declassification at the time, was not the head of the disinformation agency.
yeah. You know, I brought that subject up. And by the way, for those of you watching live, I'll be posting your questions here and just starting again just a minute here. But I brought that up to Lou Elizondo when he was on my show. And by the way, he'll be back in December as well. But when he was on, I said a number of people are claiming that you're a disinformation agent, and what do you think of that? And he was very passionate and very upset that there's so many people claiming that that's what he is. And he said he would never ever, you know, put any, you know, for what would be the reason he would be doing that. That was basically, you know, what he was coming back. What would be his motivation for doing that? So anyway, questions in caps, please. But I did catch this one. What are the most compelling UFO report patterns? The nuclear weapons connection, the water and oceans association, in parentheses, maybe explaining the U.S. Navy initiative, unquote, unbracket, the abduction phenomenon. What is the most compelling patterns?
Wow.
Well, and from my point of view, the nuclear weapons connection, I again, for the umpteenth time, I thought the 75 overflights were pretty dramatic, and as far as showing interest in nuclear and military facilities and testing national security. That to me was still an amazing series of events. I don't know what was behind it all. Maybe not everything was exotic, but certainly some parts of it were.
Mm-hmm. We had a guest last week that had his sighting when he was in the Army Reservists, and back in 1992, he was stationed up in Canada for military training when he had an amazing UFO encounter. Since he went out there and talked about it, he has been contacted by someone who's an aunt says that her husband and uncle, long retired, back in the I believe he said the 1970s, had a UFO nuclear warhead situation. Another person, I'm trying to follow up with him. I'd love to find out because he said he would never speak about it. Perhaps he will now feel a little more comfortable these days than he would have, say, before the last few years.
Yeah,
but that would be interesting if
the nuclear business. It's very hard to elicit information about it. in relation to UFO reports because they're pretty much exempt from FOIA scrutiny. It's obviously a very sensitive topic, and you can't really access most of that data.
To Barry's point, though, Martin, in reference to the question, beyond nuclear weapons, it's interesting to see the correlation, even here in New Mexico specifically, with UFO sightings during the development of the atomic bomb, during the development of the hydrogen bomb at Los Alamos. I have original front page newspaper headlines citing scientists and security personnel that were witnessing UFOs over Los Alamos. Mm-hmm. And so beyond the documents that we may not have access to, as Barry alluded to, even in the newspapers from that time period, a lot of that information leaked out to the press.
Some did, yeah.
And so the work of Barry and the work of Robert Hastings has really, I think, shown that strong correlation between nuclear weapons, nuclear storage, nuclear development, and UFOs.
Yeah, there's
absolutely
a called UFOs and Nukes by Robert Hastings. Yes. So it's quite a read.
Right. Yes, and you look at it this way too. When you hear, the UAP task force, and basically, talking about that they're only going to study cases 2004 forward, that type of thing. And this is supposed to be about threats. Wouldn't you think that nuclear warheads or any type of nuclear situation and disruptions of any kind would be major national security, and they'd want to focus on finding the answers to those questions? Well, because they obviously have data from back then.
Let me tell you one thing that's missing from the preliminary report. They're talking about the agencies and the other associated documents by Assistant Secretary Linton of the DOD. They're not addressed to the Defense Nuclear Agency. It says, here's a list of things, here's a list of commands that should respond to that. What about, well, it's not called I forget what it's changed to. It's changed to something similar. But the Defense Nuclear Agency is for incidents, and one of the things that they do is was incidents and accidents about nuclear weapons. Why is that left off? It's left off in the preliminary report. I'm saying, what?
Yes.
What? Martin, let me give you an analogy. This is how I kind of view the situation with regard to their hesitancy to look at anything prior to 2004. Imagine you're a new police investigator that's working on a police department, and you've been informed that there's been a number of burglaries in your city, in various areas. And you come on board and you say, you know what, I'm going to investigate these burglaries moving forward, but I'm not going to look at the information that you've gathered over the last year and a half. Even though if you look at the information that's been gathered, you could plot and see, well, where are these burglaries occurring, which might give you a better indication of where the future burglaries are going to occur. It's putting blinders on. It's I think, institutional ignorance not to take advantage of the data that we have available.
Right. I agree. Absolutely. Now, this was just a thought I had earlier. And again, I'm going to be posting up these questions, and I do appreciate in chat you posting those questions. But if the extraterrestrial hypothesis would not be part of what we're seeing, and this is just a speculation question for anyone that wants to tackle it, what would be the next possible idea? Or is it a bunch of different things, possibly?
I don't speculate. I'll leave it to the others.
Okay, good.
I'll just add, and again, I put this in my book several years ago, that if we're not dealing with the extraterrestrial hypothesis, in other words, something coming from another star system and traveling vast distances, and really I find it interesting, Martin, all the skeptical classic arguments are hinged on that. Well, what if we're dealing with string theory, and what if we're dealing with multiverses, multiple dimensions that coexist? All of those conservative classic arguments fall by the wayside because we're dealing with a whole different dynamic. The interdimensional hypothesis might be viable. I know there's been some mainstream scientists now saying perhaps it's time travelers from the future. You know, at the end of the day, despite us being surrounded by all this information, we still don't have enough information to really give us insights, I think, definitively into any one of these various theories. But I think the interdimensional one is highly intriguing.
Yes, I do too. You know, some people claim that it might explain the reason there's no sonic boom, there's no, you know, there's no gravitational issues or whatever with the travel involved, and how things, you know, appear and disappear in different places, things like that. It's all fascinating. And, you know, it would just be interesting to know what type of questions we should be thinking of when we're looking into this.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to put up this. This is something that comes up all the time, as you know it. How do you envision disclosure taking place if it ever is to? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I'll just say real briefly, and I'll let my friends jump in. I think we're already seeing it. I think it's playing out right now.
Yeah, but
I've
heard other people. I've heard other people say the same.
It's disclosure with a lowercase d, not an uppercase d. It's not disclosure as many UFO proponents have envisioned it. But I think we're seeing I mean, it's been a major change, as I alluded to earlier. It's a 180-degree turn we've made in reference to denials, official public denials of the subject. They're acknowledging the phenomenon's real. It's, as Barry alluded to, that's a huge step.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to see the opening to a new era with regard to the subject and the government's attitude towards the subject. The question is, even if it is disclosure with the Pentagon report, to what level are we going to get any additional information? Because admittedly, we really don't know any more than we did the day the Pentagon report came out.
Disclosure, right. How would you envision that? To me, it would be credible information about the origins of the phenomenon from multiple high-up government sources whose credentials could not be impeached.
What he said, except to me, disclosure is a 4-letter word, and people that use it, we should get the tar bucket and tar them. I am so tired of this word. I don't believe that anybody has the answer. So we're not going to get disclosure. We're going to get more information. Thank you.
Yeah, but that's what it would be if good information came out. It would be disclosed. It's
well, I said what you said.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Well, you know, I've of course, I haven't been doing this anywhere near as long as any one of you have been doing this, and I've heard that right from day one. But I also look back, and I think the 1960s, and there was a gentleman talking. He didn't use the word disclosure. He says, "I just want the government to tell in my lifetime. I got to know what this is." And of course, he's long gone by now. And I don't know if we'll ever know. You know, I don't know if we'll ever get the source of the government. Just what you were mentioning earlier, Barry. I don't think. I mean, even if that happened exactly how you just said, Barry, do you think people would believe it?
Oh, you're always going to have people dissenting from that. They'll doubt every word of it, even if it's entirely true. That's just the nature of people. You know, sometimes to be agreeable, sometimes to be contrary. And sometimes that contrariness doesn't come from any reasoning. It's just being contrary.
Yeah.
So you'll get all sorts of opinions once that happens.
And Martin, you mentioned this person from the 60s, I believe you said, that was, you know, just to know the truth, you know, before they're gone. What we have to, and again, I think this is what is interesting about the gentleman I'm with, is looking at the history, looking at what was written decades ago. Disclosure is nothing new. In the 50s, in the 60s, there were rumors that the government's going to release all this information. We're hearing rumors, right, Barry, that this is all this information is going to come out very, very soon.
Yeah, constantly.
Radio shows that I've been digitizing from the 60s and the 70s, they were saying the same thing. After decade after decade after decade, you have to have some skepticism with regard to disclosure. But again, that being said, the Pentagon report is here, and they're making new statements with regard to the subject matter. So I think it's a new era with regard to the subject. Whether you want to call it disclosure, I mean, I don't want to get hung up on labels, but we're definitely in a new era now.
We've been saying the things that are in the task force report years and years ago, but now the government is backing us up in what we had said.
It's validating, if anything.
Right, exactly.
So Hastings had a Navy fighter pilot talk to him about sightings over the Hanford nuclear plant in World War II. And he was the Navy was reconstituting fighter squadrons, and one of their missions was to investigate aerial intrusions over the Hanford plant. They moved radar in there, and they moved anti-aircraft in there, and this pilot is talking about encountering these things over the Hanford. And then we had two other Navy pilots had done this. So Barry found an interview with the head of the Hanford plant after they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So the war is over. And he had promised the Seattle Star, I'll give you an exclusive interview about what we're doing at Hanford and what's taking place here to the reporter. He said, the day the war is over. And so the reporter went up there, he got an interview, and he confirmed, one, we moved radar in there, we moved anti-aircraft in there, and we were getting aerial intrusions. And Barry found that article. I sent it to Hastings, and he said, we're a couple of days too late. This gets me emotional. But here is his vindication. Here is what he told us, and the head of the Hanford plant vindicated him.
Interesting. And do you remember exactly what year that was, Jan?
It was 1945.
Yeah.
The war
right after
1945. Yeah, so it was going on in 44 from January or December. I think it was December 44 up until the Hanford plant, after the war was over.
That's amazing.
It's on my website. If you go to 1945, and there's the whole story about UFOs over the Hanford plant that we have so far is on www.project1947, all one word, .com.
Yeah,
look at 1945. Look at 1945, and it's there.
Excellent. Here's another question. I'm not familiar with this, but maybe one of you may be familiar about the FBI file saying that flying saucers are interdimensional. Is anyone aware of that?
Yeah.
Is it
not
right?
I'm not familiar with that one, Martin.
Okay, there's a lot of things in there. That says the FBI uses they're reporting to headquarters about information they heard or they got from somebody. They're not endorsing it. There's one in there about finding alien bodies and things like that.
Yeah.
That's a very quoted thing. It's from some UFO guy who wrote it down in one of his publications or a letter or something, and people quote that as if it's coming from the FBI. The FBI is only reporting they got that document from somebody to headquarters.
Yeah,
that's happening. Can't people read? That's the problem.
The FBI couldn't draw conclusions like that anyway. I think that would have to come from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is just reporting them, and it says right on there, we got this from the place out there in San Francisco. The Flying Roll.
Oh, the Borderland Science.
Borderland Science.
Mm.
They said, we got this from somebody from Borderland Science. So it's somebody else's report of what they thought it happened. It's not the FBI's report. The FBI is quoting the report.
I see. Okay.
That's a hard concept to get across to some people.
But to Jan's point, in the defense of those that sometimes read that, you're only seeing an excerpt. And I think context and, again, provenance is extremely important when you're trying to look at these documents.
Sure. Here's a question posed to you from someone that I myself love to explore. Say, when I'm in a very early New England house, I love to explore, like, okay, I'll find a Thomas Jefferson letter or something, like really, really excited when I find things in houses that, especially when people didn't know they existed. So I wanted to know if any of you would like to share in your research where all of a sudden you just go, oh my goodness, I can't believe what I just found, and get really excited. Anyway.
I've got one.
Okay, good.
I've got a great story on that one. Many people may know I investigated and researched the 1950 Farmington, New Mexico Flying Saucer Armada for 3 full days, broad daylight sightings of dozens to hundreds of flying saucers reported in the newspaper, in government documents from the time period. I filed FOIA requests in the Barry Greenwood tradition to get the unredacted OSI documents from their investigation on this case. Have tracked down 2 of the living witnesses that are still alive in their 70s and 90s, respectively, and have really, I think, synthesized and put all this information together to really give us a good idea of what transpired on what was a very early but very dramatic case, when, I might add, there were really no civilian UFO groups doing active investigations. The only really serious work that was done was by Dr. James McDonald about a decade and a half later, when he investigated that. But I love this story, and I love that question, Martin, because I was talking to these 2 gentlemen on the phone one day, as we often do, and I forget if I interrupted Barry or Jan. I was going through some files while I was talking. I had them on speakerphone, and I'm looking at the October 1950 NICAP files, and I come across a document, and it's a NICAP report form from purportedly related to an October 1950 sighting, and I see the name Hulan Pace, and that's a very unusual name. I've never known anybody named Hulan Pace before, so it definitely stood out. If anybody else would have been leafing through these files, Martin, it wouldn't have even been a blip on the radar. I knew that name because that was one of the additional witnesses I uncovered when I got the unredacted Air Force OSI documents. So I knew the name. It was one of the witnesses that we hadn't known about before. I see the name Hulan Pace. It's got to be the same guy. How many Hulan Paces are there out there? So I pull the document out while these 2 gentlemen are chattering. They think I'm listening, and I was completely distracted. And I pulled the document out, and I have it here now. It's an original report form that was dated from the 1960s, interviewing Hulan Pace from Farmington, New Mexico, describing the incident from 1950. But he must have erroneously remembered it from being from October of that year, not the spring of that year, which often happens with witnesses. They'll think back, well, I don't remember the month, but I remember I had a light jacket on and it was kind of cool. Quite often people remember things that they'll remember something like that, but they won't remember the month.
Sure.
But when you read the report, it is a play-by-play of the incident that occurred in Farmington. But what was unique about this was the document had 2 additional witness names that no UFO researcher or historian had ever heard of tied to this case. Even more important, we had, for the first time ever, eyewitness sketches. He sketched the object, both viewing it from below and viewing it from the side. And it was basically a lenticular type of object. But to date, in 70 years, we never had any witness sketches. We had verbal accounts, we had typewritten accounts, but no sketches. So just by happenstance, going through an October 1950 file, I found a new witness report that mentioned 2 witnesses we never had on historical record And for the first time in almost 70 years, we had eyewitness sketches.
Unbelievable. Well, we only have about 3 minutes left. Do either one of you, can you relate to having, just sifting through, or even if, Barry, even if it's a FOIA report, just getting something that makes your eyes bug out?
Very quickly, I think around 1992, I went to the National Archives to look through government documents, and I spent all day looking and looking, coming up with nothing of the leads I had. And at the last minute, I decided, well, let me see if I can find anything about the old Foo Fighters, because we didn't have a great deal on it, a lot of stories, but official documents were hard to come by. And I ordered one box which contained reports of the night fighter squadrons in Europe at the time. They were known to have been involved in these incidents. So I went through it. The box was about 2 feet long, and I didn't have a great deal of time left before they were going to close. And I turned up 15 documents, which all alluded to strange, funny lights in the sky, and the term Foo Fighters was actually used. That was the first time I had seen that.
Yeah, in official documents.
Yeah,
it's in the
real official
newspapers.
documents.
But
So,
official documents, they didn't
I
use it.
wrote up a piece on it, and I was really thrilled with that.
Wow, excellent. That's great.
That's what was that? That's almost 40 years after the end of the Second World War. It took us that long to find official documents on
People
that.
hadn't gone through them.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Well, we're out of time, but Dave, would you like to give out where people can actually peruse a little bit of the archive that you have online now, and how anyone can get a hold of all of you? I know you mentioned, Jan, your website earlier. But, if you go around, we just got a minute here.
Sure. Jan has some really good material on his website. Right now, I'm posting vintage recordings I've digitized on www.davidmarlerufo.com. If you go to the audio archives tab, you'll get a sampling of some of these vintage reel-to-reel recordings that quite literally may be the only recordings that exist from some of these old radio shows dating back to the late 1950s. So some really rare vintage material. And so I would encourage people to go there.
Yes, I love that, by the way. I've listened to some. They're really fascinating. And Jan, just throw out your website one more time.
www.project1947.com.
And
what I'm trying to do right now is I'm trying to duplicate things that I've written to Congress about former investigations before 2004. And it's just not the Air Force. There's a lot of people that pick this subject up and work with it for maybe a year at a time and then dropped it again. So I'm trying to tell them this is where this information exists, but we can't get at it.
Okay, great. Barry, real quickly, can people get a hold of you? Or I see you're on Twitter.
I'm on Twitter, but I'm benign. I don't get it. I'm going to suggest you contact either of these other two gentlemen.
Well, what about your archives?
Yeah, that's a catalog. I'm going to be scanning things, and the scans are more important than a name of an article.
Right, but
actually be a scan.
You've got your publications too on that.
Yeah, but that should go to you check out Dave's or Jan's site. I'll be shifting things over to them like that in scanned images.
Well, I love how you're almost arguing at the very end. That's good. All right. Thanks so much. It's been real enjoyable.
Thanks, Martin.
My pleasure to share the show with all of you iconic people. Thanks so much for what you do.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you, everyone. We'll be back next week with Martin Keller, and I appreciate you watching. And we'll be back at the regular time, I should say, on Tuesday, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky.